Next, we'll talk about discrimination in housing based upon religion. Not as big a factor, not as common an occurrence, but it can. And this prohibition covers instances of overt discrimination against members of a particular religion, as well as less direct actions such as zoning ordinance, etc., against using private homes as places of worship. That's not an application for us as real estate agents. But building on the principles we just talked about a second ago, if the let's say if the Jewish buyer comes to you and says, I want to be in a Jewish neighborhood, you can't take them. You can't make that decision for them, or you can't decide, Mr. Spielberg, I'm going to take you down over here because it's close to the temple. You don't make those distinctions. You show them homes anywhere, and whatever their means and their expressed wishes lead you to think that they ought to be looking at houses, regardless of the ethnicity, regardless of the race, regardless of the religion. Now, if they request to be in a certain area, yeah, you can comply with that, but you cannot try to put people in certain areas based upon their ethnicity, race, color, etc. You've got also in here discrimination in housing based upon sex, which if you read it, that does not apply so much to us. Maybe if you're a landlord renting to people who are down and out and say, well, the rent's going to be cheap, but you'll have to spend the weekend at my place. That's not something we get into. Next is discrimination in housing based on national origin. That may become more and more of an issue in the future with immigration being such a key topic on the national political scene, but we don't see much of that now. Perhaps with the rise of Middle East tensions that could become a problem, but again, the same principles. Just because somebody is from China, that does not mean they want to live in Chinatown, or just because they're from wherever they want to live in an area that a lot of people from their neighborhood or their home country are from. So you don't take them to those neighborhoods just on that alone, unless they request it. You show them houses as you would anybody else. You've got discrimination in housing based upon familial status. That has never been a factor for us. You've got discrimination in housing based upon disability. Again, you've got this stuff here that you should have read. Disability is defined as a list of things: blindness, hearing, mobility impairment, HIV, retardation, alcoholism, etc. I want to point out, though, that disability, I want to be clear on this, that we understand, that you understand that current users of controlled substances and also sex offenders or juvenile offenders, they are not considered disabled under the Fair Housing Act by virtue of that status. I guess what I want to say is if you're with somebody and you think you're at some kind of risk, but you're concerned that you might be violating something by not working further with an offender or an addict, then I'd say let's get out of that relationship and let's see later on if we have to defend you. I'd rather you be alive to be defended than feel compelled to work with somebody because you think they have one of these problems. I want to read this aloud. This company conducts business in accordance with all federal, state, and local fair housing laws. It is our policy to provide housing opportunities to all persons, regardless of race, color, religion, sex, familial status, handicap, or national origin. The company's fair housing procedures are not recommendations. They must be followed by everyone associated with the company. Now, let me give you a situation and go back to the race issue for a second. We're back in 1981 again. Remember, I'm telling you, rates are high. I have a buyer call me. He's moving here from out of town. And he's with a company that's going to transfer him in usually for a few years. He'll be followed by other people. He will be here 3 years probably, and he'll be moving out again. And he's got a great company settlement package. So, in other words, this guy is gold-plated. Transferee, has to buy, has the ways and means, going to be moving again, bringing me other people coming with him. So he's somebody I want to take good care of. And on top of that, I didn't tell you, he'd worked for my father out of state. So I have every business reason in the world to want to take care of him, as well as the personal reason. I want, if word gets back to Dad, Junior did a good job, and that's the kind of, I want to make the Dad proud. and I didn't. What I didn't mention, he's black. And so while we're riding around looking at houses in the fall of 1981, I come around a corner in this neighborhood, and two old boys, retirees types, are outside leaning on their rakes. And I come around the corner and I see their eyes peering through my windshield. They're looking at me, giving me a look that says, "You keep on driving." And I got to thinking about it, and I thought, now hold a second. If you're 70 years old in a $70,000 neighborhood, now let's multiply everything by about 5, adjust for inflation from when this thing happened, because you can't find a $70,000 house anymore, but just bear with me. But if you're 70 years old in a $70,000 house, my thought was you probably would have different attitudes than a 30-year-old in a $70,000 house. Would you not agree? I mean, it's like I would ask you, do you think your attitudes on race and is the same as your grandfather's? Probably not. I hope not. Mine's not, and probably going to be different from my grandson's. So I got to thinking about that. I'm riding around with this buyer who is mighty important to me, and I think, maybe I ought to consider where the demographics, what I perceive at least of the demographics of these neighborhoods I'm showing him, because as a black guy in Birmingham, Alabama in 1981, perhaps he'd be more comfortable in a younger neighborhood closer to his age than in a neighborhood where, like I just described. And so after thinking about it, the next day we got in the car, I said, here's a thought. Would you like for me to look at, when I'm setting up these houses, consider sort of the makeup of who lives in the neighborhoods and show you based upon that? And he said, no, don't do that. You just show me the houses and let me sort of figure it out for myself, see if I want to live there or not, and I'll make those decisions. I'm comfortable doing that. So we went ahead and I did that. We found a house, and by the way, I got him a 16 5/8% loan, which at the time was so good he would have put me up for governor against Wallace in the next year's election. It was a great 16 5/8 was a great rate. In fact, I'll digress. He bought a $72,000 house, putting 10% down. So he's getting about a $65,000 mortgage. What do you think his house payment would be? A $65,000 mortgage right now would be somewhere in the probably $400 a month payment range, at least for P&I. But his payment was over $1,000, so he could swing a big stick. He could swing a big stick at $1981, and yes, I want to take care of him. Well, he buys the house. A few months later, at one of our caravans, we have the local fair housing staff shows up, and they give us a talk about fair housing, steering, and etc. And afterward, I'm sitting around talking with him, and I relayed this incident. And I would ask you, and told him what I had offered to do, and he said, "Well, you violated the law." I was going to ask you the question. Should have asked you the question. Do you think what I did was right? Do you think what I did was motivated by good things? Do you think I was looking out for my buyer? I think I was looking out for the buyer. I was motivated by the right things. I wanted him to be happy. I had personal reasons because he was a friend of the family as well as business reasons. I wanted him to be happy and refer everybody he could to me. So I was motivated by all great things, but the long and the short was the fair housing guy said that was a violation of fair housing what you did. I pointed out to him I volunteered to violate fair housing, but he turned me down. But nonetheless, your motive for doing these things does not offset the fact that the doing of them is wrong. Even though you might want to treat your buyer like you'd want to treat your brother, it's still. So I hope I've made the example, made a case for motive, and not being as important as conduct and behavior, regardless of your color, regardless of the color of the person who asks you questions and who you're showing houses to. Next is lead-based paint disclosure. Lead-based paint disclosure is required by federal regulation. Owners of residential properties built before 1978, when the use of lead-based paint was common, have to disclose to buyers or renters the presence of known lead-based paint hazards. A lead-based paint disclosure statement must be attached as a separate item to all real estate sales and lease contracts on pre-1978 residential properties. Real estate practitioners must distribute to buyers and renters a federal lead hazard pamphlet, but won't be responsible for ensuring that people read and understand the brochure. Now, the buyers have up to 10 days to do a lead risk assessment, have that performed on the property if they want one. Interestingly, I don't see that. I don't hear of that being done much in Birmingham, but I have heard of it being done in some other towns outside of the Birmingham area. Now, the fines for violating lead-based paint disclosure can be up to $11,000. Can be up to $11,000, and can be levied up to $64,000 per transaction. And those fines are not covered by your errors and omissions insurance. Now, disclosure has to be made. I said this in the first few minutes. It's counterintuitive. Disclosure has to be made before submission of the offer. What I'm saying there, just maybe I'll reiterate, you can't write up the offer contingent upon the purchaser getting a lead-based paint disclosure form signed that he's happy with. Even though that makes perfectly good sense and would work in the real world and every other contingency is handled the same way, the law says that lead-based paint has to be, the presence of lead-based paint has to be disclosed actually before you put the pen to the paper to write the offer. So, as I was saying in the first part, I'm standing up leading a meeting of people from 50 states and 4 territories, and I'm supposed to be the knowledgeable guy. When I realize all of a sudden that what we're doing in Birmingham is what I just described. We're doing things that made sense to us, and I'm listening to somebody from Kansas City tell about how they got busted. The lead-based paint police came and looked at their files and found that they had not disclosed it up front, and they paid these big numbers. I'm standing in front of everybody trying to look smart, and I got sweat running down my back because I have to go back to Birmingham and change what we're doing. But we did that, and in changing what Realty South did, we changed the conduct of all the other agencies around here, so that what we do now, if it's built before 1978, our agents take the form to the house, have the seller sign the disclosure form. And then we make copies of the lead-based paint disclosure form, make a bunch of copies, make 20 copies, leave it there in the house. If an agent's showing the house and they think their buyer is showing some buying signs, they can pick one up and take it with them. So when they write the offer, they've got their part done. They can have that signed by the buyer and then go about the business of writing their contract. To do otherwise, strictly speaking, to do otherwise is a violation. Now, if you find yourself in a house that your buyer wants to buy it and the agent is not with the program, or maybe all the lead-based paint forms have been picked up. I can't tell you it's not against the law. I can tell you get it done as fast as you can and try to document that you've done your part, and maybe the other agent won't do their part. The likelihood that you'll be visited by the lead-based paint police is not strong, but make every effort to do things the way the law prescribes you to do it. You've got to think about: do I want to take the chance? Do you want to make a buyer not buy because of that? As a teacher, I'm sure I'm supposed to say yes, but in truth, help the buyer buy the house and get this lead-based paint thing done as quickly as you can and document your actions on it. Also, you need to know that failure to get the lead-based paint form signed can make you legally vulnerable in another problem in a civil case. We had a case where the agent discussed the house was built in the 50s, and it was almost certainly painted with lead-based paint, but she forgot to have the form signed. And the long and the short was, later on the buyers came up with a problem on the house, and because the buyer had not signed the lead-based paint form, we were vulnerable for something, a property condition which should have been her problem, the buyer's problem after closing. But we were vulnerable because if they'd gone through our files and seen that form, that agent would have been doing time down at Atmore now, or maybe at Julia Tutwiler. So get that form signed, get it signed in a timely manner.